The crystal wine glass caught the light from the chandelier as my father raised it high in Victor's $10.4 million mansion. I sat at the polished mahogany table, wearing the same simple dress I'd worn 100 times before, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I preferred the comfort of routine. Around me, my family smiled and nodded, completely absorbed in celebrating my brother's success. The November Thanksgiving dinner was exactly what I had expected. An exhibition of wealth, a subtle performance of superiority, and an opportunity for my parents to reinforce a hierarchy that had existed my entire life. I was Valerie Hayes, 34 years old, a land use consultant specializing in water rights law and infrastructure development. I had spent the last 3 years taking contract work with the state because it offered stability and flexibility that I needed to care for my mother when she developed cancer. While my mother was in chemotherapy, my brother Victor had been closing real estate deals. While I was managing her medical expenses that consumed my savings because my brother refused to contribute, Victor was purchasing land for his luxury development. And now, at this dinner, my father was about to ensure that everyone understood exactly where his loyalty lay. To Victor, my father announced, his voice booming across the dining room, who understands that success requires ambition. He's built something remarkable. He paused, his eyes sliding to me with unmistakable disappointment. Valerie, he continued, his tone shifting to something patronizing, you need to be realistic about your future. You'll never own a home like this. You're too soft with money. Your work is modest. Stable, perhaps, but not visionary. The table fell silent. I felt the weight of every gaze. My mother's pity, my sister's awkwardness, my father's certainty that he was delivering an important truth. Then Victor smiled, that cruel, smug smile I had seen countless times across our lives. She'll be lucky to afford the rent on a storage unit, he said, his voice casual but the cruelty unmistakable. Everyone laughed. My parents laughed. Even my mother, weakened by months of chemotherapy, smiled uncomfortably because challenging Victor was never encouraged in our family. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity, the kind that comes when you finally understand that the people you've sacrificed for don't actually see you at all. I excused myself from the table and drove home to my modest apartment, and I began to make a plan. I had not left the State's employ by choice. 3 years ago, I had worked as a senior land use consultant for the State Infrastructure Board. The work was exceptional, complex, intellectually demanding, crucial to the state's future development. I had specialized in water rights law and easement acquisition, particularly for long-term pipeline and utility projects. Then my mother got sick. I had reduced my hours, eventually accepting a contract position that allowed me flexibility. The pay remained substantial, $95,000 annually, but the company was different. I was no longer embedded in the state bureaucracy. I maintained a professional relationship with my old colleagues, but I was technically independent. That distinction was crucial. 3 years ago, when I was still employed directly by the state, I had successfully navigated the complex acquisition of a small, seemingly worthless parcel of land. The property was strategically located in the corner of what would eventually become a major residential development. The parcel itself was only worth about $40,000 in its agricultural state. But beneath it and running through several adjacent properties was the route for the Willow Creek Pipeline Project, a massive infrastructure initiative designed to bring fresh water to 3 counties over the next 15 years. The project had been funded and approved. It was in the planning phases, waiting for final environmental approvals and right-of-way acquisitions. As the state land use consultant, I had secured that critical parcel as part of the long-term pipeline infrastructure plan. When I transitioned to contract work 6 months later, the state had offered me a unique settlement. I could maintain stewardship of the easement and acquire permanent guardianship of the small parcel. Essentially, I would be the technical owner on paper, while the state retained the infrastructure rights. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. It protected the state from future liability while compensating me for my specialized knowledge and years of work on the project. The settlement came with a one-time payment of $200,000, money that paid for my mother's final months of cancer treatment. What my father didn't understand, what Victor didn't know, was that 3 years after my settlement with the state, Victor had purchased the bulk land in that area. He had bought approximately 50 acres from a previous owner who had held the property for speculative purposes. Victor's $10.4 million mansion sat directly on land that was intersected by the Willow Creek pipeline easement. He had rushed the title search. He had not checked the utility easement filings carefully. He had seen the bulk land available, calculated the development potential, and moved quickly to close the deal before prices increased. He had completely missed the parcel in the corner, the one I owned. He had completely missed the infrastructure easement that ran directly beneath his mansion. The day after Thanksgiving, I contacted Mr. Jenkins, my old supervisor at the State Infrastructure Board. "Mr. Jenkins," I said, keeping my voice professional and neutral, "I wanted to check on the status of the Willow Creek pipeline project. Is it still in the planning phases, or has it moved forward?" There was a pause on the line. Then, "Valerie, actually, I'm glad you called. We finally secured the necessary environmental approvals. The project is moving to the acquisition phase within the next 6 months. We have the budget, the timeline, and the regulatory clearance. We just need to finalize the property acquisitions." My heart began to accelerate, but I kept my voice steady. "The small parcel I held in stewardship," I said carefully, "is it still registered in my name?" "Yes," Mr. Jenkins confirmed. "You maintain technical ownership. The state retains infrastructure rights. It's all in the original agreement. Why do you ask?" "I'm just confirming that the terms of my settlement remain intact," I said, "including the state's obligation to notify me before proceeding with pipeline construction that would affect my parcel." "Of course," Mr. Jenkins said. "You're the steward. We'd need your cooperation for access and surveying." I ended the call and sat in my modest apartment, staring out at the city skyline. I owned the key to Victor's entire empire. I hired Ms. Patricia Dubois, the best land use and property law attorney in the state. Ms. Dubois was a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for winning impossible cases. She was expensive, but her record was unmatched. I met with her in her office and presented her with the complete documentation. My original employment contract with the state, the settlement agreement that granted me stewardship and ownership of the parcel, the title documents showing me as the registered owner, the infrastructure easement filing, dated and stamped by the state, showing the pipeline route directly beneath Victor's development, the state project file showing the Willow Creek pipeline moving from planning to acquisition phase. Ms. Dubois reviewed each document methodically. Her face remained neutral, but I could see her understanding the implications as she read. "Valerie," she said finally, "do you understand what you're holding?" "I think so," I said carefully. "The parcel I own is essential to the pipeline's construction route. The state will need it to proceed." "More than that," Ms. Dubois said. "The easement runs beneath the residential development that your brother created. The moment the state begins pipeline construction, there will be significant disruption to that development. Property values will be affected. Construction timelines will be disrupted. And most importantly," she paused for emphasis, "the state has the authority to use eminent domain if necessary to acquire the surrounding properties for access and construction." I felt my breath catch. "Under state law," Ms. Dubois continued, "when eminent domain is invoked for public utility infrastructure, property owners are entitled to fair market value compensation. However, that compensation is typically calculated based on the property's value at the time of acquisition. Once the public knows that an infrastructure project is coming, property values are reassessed." She leaned back in her chair, The properties in that development were valued at approximately $8 to $10 million, each based on their residential use. However, once an eminent domain notice is issued for pipeline construction, those same properties would be reassessed at approximately $4 to $6 million, the value of the land minus the infrastructure disruption impact. So Victor's $10.4 million mansion, I said slowly, would be worth maybe $5 to $6 million once the state issued the notice. Exactly, Ms. Du Bois confirmed. But here's what's more important. I've reviewed Victor's public financial filings. He doesn't own that property outright. He financed it with a mortgage and several equity loans. His total debt on the property exceeds $9 million. I felt something cold settle in my chest. He's leveraged to the limit, Ms. Du Bois explained. Once the property is reassessed downward, once the eminent domain process begins, his debt will exceed the property's new value. He'll be significantly underwater, and if he can't refinance or restructure the debt, his entire development could collapse. I spent 3 weeks planning. I contacted my old colleagues at the State Infrastructure Board. I had maintained professional relationships, and they trusted me. I explained that I wanted to understand the complete acquisition timeline for the Willow Creek pipeline project. What they told me was crucial. The project was scheduled to move to the land acquisition phase on March 15th. On that date, the state would issue a notice of intent to acquire for all necessary properties and easements. The public announcement would happen simultaneously. March 15th was 6 weeks away. I used that time to gather additional information through completely legal means. I obtained public records of Victor's mortgage filings. I reviewed the property tax assessments. I accessed public planning documents about the residential development. Everything pointed to the same reality. Victor had built an empire on borrowed money, and that empire was vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption the Willow Creek pipeline would create. I also learned something else during my research. Victor had been quietly pressuring the town council to consider alternative pipeline routes. He was paying for impact studies and alternative feasibility reports. He was using connections and money to try to divert the infrastructure project away from his development. It was smart strategy. It would also fail. The Willow Creek pipeline route was geologically determined, environmentally mandated, and already approved through multiple state agencies. But his attempt told me something important. Victor was nervous. He suspected there might be complications with his land acquisition, and he was trying to prevent those complications from becoming public. 3 weeks before the March 15th announcement, I made my final strategic move. I contacted Ms. Du Bois and authorized her to formally notify the State Infrastructure Board that I was prepared to cooperate fully with the Willow Creek pipeline acquisition process. I instructed her to confirm that the state had full access to my parcel for surveying, construction, and pipeline installation. I also instructed her to send a formal letter to Victor's attorney, a letter I knew would alert him to my involvement. The letter was professional, legal, and devastating. Dear Counsel, this firm represents Valerie Hayes, the registered owner of a 1.2-acre parcel located at specific coordinates on the property commonly known as the Preserve Residential Development. Our client has been advised that your client, Victor Sterling, is the primary developer of this property. We are writing to inform you that our client's parcel is subject to a state infrastructure easement for the Willow Creek pipeline project, which is scheduled to enter the acquisition phase on March 15th of this year. The pipeline construction will require direct access to our client's property and will impact the use and enjoyment of adjacent properties, including those developed by your client. Our client has authorized full cooperation with the state's acquisition and construction process. We anticipate that notices will be issued by the State Infrastructure Board within the next 4 weeks. Please advise how your client wishes to proceed. Sincerely, Patricia Du Bois, attorney at law. I knew what would happen when Victor received that letter. I knew he would panic. I knew he would contact his attorney, who would conduct research and discover the same reality I had discovered. His empire was built on borrowed money on land that was about to be compromised by state infrastructure. Victor called me on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks before the announcement. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. "Valerie," he said, using a tone he'd never used with me before. Careful, almost respectful. "I received a letter from an attorney. Something about a pipeline? On our property." "Yes," I said simply. "Can you?" He stopped. "Is there a way to stop this? You worked for the state. You know these people. Can you convince them to reroute the pipeline?" I listened to the desperation in his voice. I listened to a man who had built his entire identity on being smarter, more ambitious, more successful than his quiet sister, suddenly asking for my help. "No," I said. "The pipeline route is set. It's been approved through 3 state agencies and an environmental commission. It's geologically determined. There's no alternative route. There has to be something." "There isn't," I said, and I ended the call. March 15th arrived. The State Infrastructure Board held a public meeting announcing the Willow Creek pipeline project's transition to the acquisition phase. The announcement was covered by local news. The impact was immediate. Property values in the preserve development dropped 35% within 2 days. Victor's $10.4 million mansion was suddenly valued at approximately $6.7 million. His $9.2 million in debt was now significantly underwater. The banks and lenders who had backed his equity loans began demanding additional collateral or accelerated repayment. His development company, which had been in the process of securing financing for a second phase of construction, suddenly found all funding sources pulling back. Investors panicked. Homeowners sued. Victor found himself fighting a legal battle on multiple fronts. 3 months later, Victor was forced to file for bankruptcy protection. His development company collapsed. The remaining properties in the preserve were seized by creditors. Victor lost the $10.4 million mansion, the equity he had claimed, and his professional reputation. My father's face when he read the news about Victor's financial ruin was something I will never forget. My parents had spent 34 years telling me I was soft, unambitious, incapable of building wealth. They had spent Thanksgiving dinner publicly humiliating me, and I had destroyed the golden son they so deeply loved. But here's the truth they didn't understand. I hadn't destroyed Victor to hurt them. I had simply revealed what was always true. Victor's empire was built on debt and arrogance. His investment strategy was reckless. His due diligence was careless. He was never actually brilliant. He was just lucky for a while until luck ran out. And I was never actually soft. I was just quiet. I used the vindication to do something different with my career. I left my contract work with the state and founded my own consulting firm, Hayes Land Use Solutions. I specialized in the intersection of infrastructure development and residential property. Exactly the expertise that had destroyed Victor, and exactly the expertise that would be desperately needed in the coming years. With the Willow Creek pipeline moving forward, I became the go-to consultant for property owners trying to navigate eminent domain proceedings. I became the woman developers hired to anticipate infrastructure complications before they became catastrophic. Within 2 years, my consulting firm was generating $800,000 annually. Within 5 years, I was generating $2.4 million annually. I bought a beautiful home, not a $10.4 million mansion, but a $1.2 million property that I owned completely free and clear. A home I had earned through my own work, my own strategy, and my own intellect. I paid for my mother's complete remission. I funded educational scholarships for women in land use law and infrastructure consulting. And I never, not once, had to explain myself to my family again. I attended my father's birthday dinner 5 years after Victor's collapse. My parents were older, more fragile. Their previous arrogance, worn down by the reality of aging and the public knowledge that their golden son had failed. They did not mention Victor. They did not mock my career or my home. My father looked at me with something that might have been regret, though he never actually apologized. As I was leaving, my mother pulled me aside. "Valerie," she said quietly, "I know we weren't kind to you. I know we didn't see you the way we should have." I waited. "I'm sorry we didn't understand," she continued. "I'm sorry we didn't realize how strong you were, how capable, how much you were doing for this family." I hugged her, but I didn't say anything. Some apologies come too late to erase the damage they're meant to repair. I stood in my office on the 15th floor of the downtown business district, my office with views of the entire city skyline, and I reflected on something my father had said at that Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. He had told me I was too soft with money. The truth was simpler. I wasn't soft at all. I was patient. I had waited for the moment when arrogance would meet reality. I had positioned myself where leverage resided. I had understood from my professional knowledge exactly what was coming and exactly how to prepare. And when the moment arrived, I had moved with absolute precision. Victor had called himself visionary. He had called his $10.4 million mansion a testament to his brilliance. But it was built on land he didn't own, leveraged by debt he couldn't manage, sitting on top of infrastructure he didn't anticipate. He had been defeated not by my vindictiveness, but by his own carelessness. And I had been vindicated not by cruelty, but by simple competence. The woman they called soft had turned out to be the only one actually paying attention. The woman they said would never own a home like her brothers had instead become the woman who understood why her brother's home was worthless. And in understanding that, I had finally understood my own worth. It had never been about matching Victor's mansion or his wealth. It had always been about knowing something he didn't, about seeing something he had missed, about being quiet enough and patient enough and smart enough to recognize exactly where the real power lay. It had been waiting in a small parcel of land beneath an easement filing in my own name. It had been there all along. I had just needed to be patient enough to wait for the moment when the world caught up. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by my father's cruel boom at Thanksgiving or Victor's mockery of my soft spending. My story proves that silence can be a weapon and patience, the patience to secure a water rights easement, can be absolute power. If this resonated with you, if your family has gaslit you into financial invisibility after you sacrificed everything, tell them this. Your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Never let their judgment define your true professional value. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. They thought I'd never own a home. I became the consultant who forced the sale of their $10.4 million mansion. Share your story below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.